Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing ideological goodness, that's right, interviews, right into your earbuds, bringing the best out of the ivory tower so you can, nerd out while you're doing dishes or exercising or watching a sleeping sick child. And today on the podcast is my friend Aaron Simmons. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing great, and thankfully I don't have a sick child at home, and my dishes are washed, so I'm ready to go, man.
That's good. It would be difficult to discuss Soren Kierkegaard while sitting next to a sleeping child or hearing the act of dishes. But
it's true. That's right.
Luckily,
of course, the distractions of finitude, right?
Yeah.
We'll navigate them as we must.
So what we were hoping to do in this conversation is lure all you dear listeners over to iheartkierkegaard.com. What's there? Well, you can sign up for an upcoming online class with Aaron and I, where we will be reading Soren Kierkegaard, 19th century Danish philosopher, father of existentialism, critic of Christendom. And he is ready to ruin your life in the best way. You might say,
that's exactly right.
You could get lost in order to find faith. So iheartkierkegaard.com. And today we have 5 reasons the church needs Kierkegaard. Now, before we get to these 5 reasons and all sorts of nerdy conversation ensues, I think it would be fun for us both to introduce ourselves by telling where we first met Kierkegaard. So we both did PhDs. We both like reading and teaching Kierkegaard. So when was it that Aaron Simmons, share a little bit about yourself when you first encountered Soren and met someone you were going to read and wrestle with for a lifetime?
Yeah, no. So I think everybody has these, where you first were kind of moments. And with Kierkegaard, it's actually something that has stayed with me very deeply. And in some ways, the way I got into Kierkegaard sort of has continued to impact the way I read. So I was actually in grad school at Florida State University, go Seminoles, who beat UNC a couple of days ago. So glad to see that. The bar has lowered for our excellence in football, but we'll take it. And so I was at Florida State and was studying intellectual history and humanities. So I did not go there to study philosophy. I was a humanities interdisciplinary sort of person and was in a class taught by a literature professor, and the class was called Romantic Irony. And so in this class, we were reading, a variety of things, Jane Austen, Lord Byron, various topics. And we met this strange guy named Soren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard, we read because he has this section in Either Or where he talks about, ironic engagement. And of course, he wrote a dissertation on the concept of irony. And so we read him and his thoughts on Don Juan and Mozart's Don Giovanni and all these different areas that were to him super heavy with, this idea of irony and Socratic irony and how this is distinguished from Romantic conceptions. And so I remember reading this and thinking, what is going on? Like, it didn't make any sense. There was nothing intelligible. We'd go from one little reading that sounded like somebody was depressed and ready to jump off a bridge. And then another section was all about yay, marriage. And there were these judges talking. And then we were talking to a seducer. And it was just all over the place. And I remember writing a paper for that class, trying to figure out, so Either Or, which is the right one. And of course, it didn't even occur to me that there was a third option, that actually were meant to go somewhere else in religion. And so I wrote this paper. It was horrible. And as a result of that, sought out reading some more Kierkegaard. And, then started working with David Kangas there at Florida State and got deeper into him. And I should say, before that class where I had read some Kierkegaard and encountered all of the pseudonyms and really wrestled with it, the only Kierkegaard I had ever sort of been exposed to was the Kierkegaard of Francis Schaeffer, right? The Kierkegaard that is ruining the church and ruining rational Christian life, and the irrationalist who wants us to engage in, the lower story of human existence or whatever. And so when I hit Kierkegaard, it was such a breath of fresh air, though confusing air, like taking a big, suck of nitrogen or
Yeah.
something. It just sort of throws your mind for a loop, I guess. And as a result of that first encounter, what I discovered was somebody who, and this is ultimately why I stuck with him, somebody who understood Christian life to be primarily about affect and engagement. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about thinking, though I rarely have found a Christian who thought more compellingly and more nuancedly about Christian life and finitude and existence. But man, like suddenly my Pentecostal background made sense to me, right? Mm-hmm. It was okay to be a philosopher who takes this affect really, really, really seriously. And, you know, I've said many, many times that Kierkegaard is who made it possible for me to remain a Christian. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's kind of where I met him, and we've been dating ever since.
Oh, that's awesome. I fell in love with Kierkegaard when my dad handed me a book of, you know, selections of Kierkegaard in high school, because I was obsessed with the fact that I was going to die, and most people are dodging the reality of their finitude, and then I was like, why are we doing this? Like, you know, and then when in college, my philosophy professor was a huge Kierkegaard fan and managed to assign him in basically every class other than medieval philosophy. You know, so like for intro to philosophy, we read philosophical investigations, and for ethics, we read works of love, and in contemporary philosophy, we read, I think we read either or, and then, no, it was, anyway, I don't know. We read them all. But I went in college, when I was a sophomore, was when 9/11 took place. And it was his critique of Christendom that really made me trust even the parts of him that make me uncomfortable. That he was able to look at his age with such a vicious attack on the kind of idolatry we normalize to, that you can't distinguish your faith, that the infinite became finite in a homeless first century Jew from a deep allegiance to the institutions of state and church. And that's like when you have this, you know, the biggest global protest as we're about to go into Iraq, and you just get cheerleaders from churches all around. And so in a similar way, but for, you know, a different historical moment, Kierkegaard enabled me to stay Christian, because his invitation, the act of faith, it really is acidic to the demands of allegiance from the state or from Christendom. And I think today, from whatever our true religion, economism, and the way it dominates culture. So like, I'm excited about this class because in multiple times in my own life and in my personal life, but also in my intellectual kind of quest, Kierkegaard is the perfect disruptor in a time we need disruption. So
I think that's exactly right. And it's interesting when you say that it sort of awoke you to this, you know, kind of critical dynamic within your Christian faith. One of the things that I think Kierkegaard enabled for me was the idea that what it looked like to be a critically engaged, reflective, thinking, passionate Christian didn't have to look like, you know, analytic apologetics, right?
Which is good.
Which is good. I mean, and I should say, you know, I've learned a lot from that discourse as well, but it was what I had grown up in. I went to a Christian university. You know, our philosophically inclined courses, you know, strategically dodged the Kierkegaards and Nietzsches of the world, and, you know, spent much more time with, you know, Planigas and Bill Craigs, right? Yeah. And, you know, there's lots to be learned in both spaces. But one of the things that Kierkegaard did for me was he showed me that, yeah, we can make critique a mode of love, and we can make questions a mode of life. And those two things were so out of step with the way that I had been taught, right? Which was, no, the questions are the things that we answer in Christ, rather than Christ being a really important question to a lot of the churches and society's answers that have been given us. And I don't think that it leads us to a, you know, cul-de-sac of doubt or uncertainty. I think instead what it does is invites us to realize the risk that is involved in what it means to be faithful. And faithfulness then gets big, right? It's not narrowed. It's not, oh, well, do you have warranted assent of P, right? Well, maybe. I think Kierkegaard believed lots of propositions about the divine in Christian life. But at the end of the day, propositional assent somehow now became not the goal. The goal was, how do you live inside of your own flesh? Mm-hmm. And how do you do this with others in light of the fact that your flesh is also dust unto dust? And that existential quality, that awareness that Christian life is rooted in what it means to be intentional about the task of finitude. Mm-hmm. For me, man, I was 22? And suddenly, what am I doing with my life, and where am I going, and what's the purpose? And, of course, all of us in, Christian colleges have the bookmark of Jeremiah 29:11, above our beds, right? Because everything's got to be planned, and God's got the one for me, and, who's my spouse going to be, and what's my career? And then Kierkegaard walks in and says, yeah, who has been rendered sleepless by Abraham? Right? Not, yes, because God had a plan and Isaac was going to work out, and this, it was have you really wrestled with this? Or, in practicing Christianity, where he shows up and he's like, look, the way we're practicing Christianity should explode any self-complacent assumptions about our own dignity, that in relation to God, we're nothing. And yet that invites us then to be maximally invested in the lowly and marginalized of the world. I mean, this was not a different Christianity in the sense that it was like a rejection of what I had been raised into, but it was a deepening of the impulse that had attracted me to what I had been raised into.
Yeah. And
this came then with that kind of, critical bite that let me say, it's okay to let your questions sit for a long time. Mm-hmm. Right. And I've sat on those questions now for, over 20 years.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. And I hope everyone here decides to join us. iHeartKierkegaard.com. Now we're going to jump into the 5 reasons the church needs Kierkegaard today. And number 1, the first reason is Kierkegaard reminds us that faith is about lived commitment, not simply right belief. Now, this sounds like you're starting down the slippery slope into radical relativism. I'm really,
you know me well, sir.
Aaron, are we going to have to pray for you? But go ahead.
Yeah, no, you sound like many people in my churches when I talk about these things. It's the bugbear of postmodern relativism that comes quickly to grasp. And this was ultimately, I think about, my early engagement with Francis Schaeffer. I think this is what worried him, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, let's be honest, it's not a dumb worry. It is the case that if we, especially as philosophers, my goodness, if we're not concerned with holding true belief so far as possible, that then aligns our lives with a love of truth, then I don't think we're doing philosophy. So this is why, it's not simply about right belief. It's also about trying to get our beliefs as correct as we can. But one of the things I think is such a mess in the way that we understand too much of Christian living, especially in light of, divisive political contexts and culture wars and, the worries about secular humanism and, my goodness, now the nonsense about, critical race theory being antithetical to the church and all of this. It's horrifying, right? Because what it's doing is saying, hey, here's this set of things, and all that matters about Christian life is, can you say yes to these things? Well, Kierkegaard gives this great example under the pseudonym Johannes Climacus. He says, well, let's think about truth. So if the point of right belief is to hold true beliefs, let's think about truth. And he says, who in fact is in truth? The person who goes to the church, worships the true God, but does so without passion, without investment, maybe without getting too close to home, maybe as a manifestation of their identity and political loyalties that reinforce their social power, maybe, right? And so they go and do that. And then on the other hand, he says, take somebody who is in what he calls, a pagan context, who is going to worship, as he views it, not the true God, but worships that God with all of the passion of their interiority, right? Their life is found in that relationship, and it opens them up to what it means to exist fully. And Kierkegaard says, seems to me the latter is living truthfully in a way the former is not. Now, of course, this tension is not a radical dichotomy. He thinks that the best option would be to worship, as he sees it, the true God truly, right? So it's important that we not think that there are only these two extremes. The goal is to just let wherever we find ourselves to be wrecked by the idea that lived commitment is a risky, risky thing. And he says somewhere that life is the moment of decision, right? But how is it that, especially, I grew up in evangelicalism, I no longer identify that way, but man, everything's about the moment of decision, that happens at a Billy Graham crusade or a youth camp, so that you can go back to your high school and testify, right?
Yeah,
or
all of life's best decisions are made with your eyes closed, heads bowed, and following intense emotional social gathering and implied threats. That's when true decisions
so you're saying that fear and emotional intoxication tend to lead us into decisions we might later rethink? Come on now, Tripp.
No, but if the decision is either for Jesus or for a purity ring, then it's obviously what
must
God
be
wants.
right.
Yeah, obviously.
Must be what God wants.
Yeah. If at some point during it there was a DC talk song with hand motions, then it just levels up a whole nother form.
It's as if we lived the same life. It sucks because there's so much that can be good in all of those things. But that's why I think the church needs Kierkegaard, is those things. It's important to have an awareness of. Think about it. Why do we have the DC talk show, or Michael W. Smith, or whatever it was when I was growing up, right? The Amy Grants, or I remember Rick Kua. Remember him? I Can, I Will song. Oh, it was a bass, like a solo bassist would give concerts. It was the strangest effect ever. Loved his stuff. So why do we have the music? Why is it still today that we spend so much time and energy having freaking laser shows and smoke machines and 75-foot screens behind the praise band? Because of something Kierkegaard understood, which is we are not merely rationalistic brains and vats. We, in fact, are embodied, and we are impacted by a whole host of influences. And one of the most important is, how do we engage and discharge what it means to be a body committed to something? And so he just says, look, getting your belief right, it's not wrong. We want to care about true belief. But if that's the goal, and if the decision ends up being, yes, we played our praise and worship, which of course is usually the 5-song package. So you've got the really fancy fast one, which gets everybody up. Then you've got the second one that then introduces the pastor to be able to come up and take, a little moment and welcome people, which then allows for spreading disease by shaking hands. And then we move forward to this next song, which is, calming us down a little bit to remind us, hey, you ain't just at a concert, because, we're here to worship. And then you end with a song that then is going to open up everybody to the throne room of God, and, segue into a sermon bumper, right? So we do these things, and then we have our sermon, and then we lead to this moment of decision that happens on a Sunday morning at 11:45 a.m. Kierkegaard looks at all of this and says, kind of like the minor prophet Amos, right? And your religious ceremonies kind of make me sick. This misses the whole point. The goal is lived relationship, not a single instant where you somehow decide the rest of your life. Kierkegaard's thought is you decide the rest of your life at every instant, because will you continue to live into what you think matters? And your life is what actually then constitutes it as mattering, right? And I continue to find that the thing, ironically, that's the thing that keeps me in church, right? Even though I struggle with church in a lot of ways, the thing that keeps me in church is precisely Kierkegaard's awareness of this is something we do at every instant. But the problem with churches is that they often make it about an instant so that we can then move on. And Kierkegaard asks in Fear and Trembling, where do they think they're going now? Yeah. Like what's further than faith? Where is it they think they're going to land? Faith is a lived, passionate investment that is so radically personal and yet so radically invitational and shared. The goal is not to do this and check a box, right? It's kind of like I tell people sometimes faithfulness gets like listed as one of our success goals. So it's like, all right, wash the dishes, run 5 miles, get the medicine for my kid, right? We check off the boxes of our to-do list, like, oh, be faithful, move forward, right? And I'm like, nah, faith looks much more like a relational, personal thing. Like, where does the box check of be a good husband go? Oh, did it on a Thursday afternoon, done. Whoa, and now I can move forward, right? Or love my wife. Whew, I did that yesterday, thank God. So I ain't got to do it again today. Like the whole idea is, no, I love my wife and I love my son by loving them, right? And Kierkegaard might say gerundizing of reality is what happens. It's not about faith. It's about faithing our life, right? And I think that's just important because we've made it about getting our belief right to attack the others who are wrong, rather than living with all we got so we can invite others to live with us in a society that flourishes.
Yeah. No, I endorse that. Now I'm going to say number 2, because I realize each one of these could lead to an individual conversation. No,
we're giving the context for the other 4.
Yeah, that's what it is. Number 2, Kierkegaard helps us see that Christian nationalism is antichrist.
Yeah. Ooh. That's swinging for the fences, right? Gut punches. Kierkegaard has this idea of Christendom. And what he means by Christendom is where Christianity becomes a power structure. It becomes, as he puts it, the establishment. And this is really weird, he thinks, because Christianity is fundamentally about a radical personal relationship to a personal God that then wrecks all of our presumptions to self-sufficiency, to independence, and throws us into a relation with others in their lowliness, in their embodiment, in their humanity. And that idea is something that fundamentally stands opposed to the idea of, the great edifices of power and the great triumphs of human achievement that then sit, upon the hill and have shuttles running to the 19 parking lots and great coffee in the lobby, right? Now, again, no hate on good parking systems and coffee. Well, I hate on coffee. I hate coffee. Yeah, let's have good tea in our churches. That's good. The problem is we think that in doing this and then allowing that sort of church on the hill to get attached to social power, right? Oh, well, the church needs to then be the thing that influences and speaks to politics, not in a prophetic way, right? Kierkegaard had no problem with that, where we're speaking truth to power. It's the truth of power seems to be what the church is after, right? Yeah. And Kierkegaard saw this in this Christendom mode and said, nah, the task is to bring Christianity back to Christendom because it's lost itself in the attempt to force Christianity into a manifestation of social power and social triumph. And this idea of Christian nationalism then becomes, of course, a rather easy next step when you've got Christianity that's confused with the social powers of the world. Well, then isn't your society the Christian nation? Isn't it now the model for everyone else on how not only to live in Christ, but to live in the world? Doesn't it now, whatever it does, isn't that glorified by God? Now, isn't every act of violence or force a just war? Like, that move is one that Kierkegaard saw as eroding subjectivity. Mm-hmm. It eliminates you as individual, facing risk, facing decision, being a meaning maker, right? Yeah. And also finitude, dying, like all those things go away. And when they go away, we make Christianity an algorithm. We make it something that can be consumable like a good, right? You brushed your teeth, went for a bike ride, said some prayers, now on with your life. So how is it we can make Christianity not a consumable good, but actually a David Foster Wallacean conception of water? It's the very space in which our existence occurs, not a thing that we do with existence. And that move leads him to say Christian nationalism not only erodes the very condition of Christian living, but it actually is what he'll call a demonic idea. And by demonic here, it's that which distorts and turns what looks good into its inverse in a way that then propels us back into ourselves rather than canonically rupturing ourselves towards something like the divine. And this is, he doesn't say explicitly Christian nationalism is demonic, but he gives us the idea of the demonic, and he gives us this idea of Christendom, and he's showing us that, man, the goal is not so much for him to go seek the lost. Mm-hmm. The goal is to speak to those who all think they don't need doctors anymore. Yeah, right? Which, of course, ironically, is hits all too close to home in the context of evangelical vaccine denial, right? And it says, "Oh, we don't need doctors because we're all good, we're all healthy." And you're like, "Wow, yeah, maybe that's not only stupid, maybe it's evil." And I think Kierkegaard helps us see that.
Well, I think part of what you're bringing out is that there are different thrusts to different kinds of religion. And one is a very therapeutic form of religion where it succeeds by fitting you for the dominant system of the day. And in Kierkegaard's time, the church succeeded by helping you be a good family person, a good participant in the civic order, a good member of the Church of Denmark. And in fact, everyone's a member of the Denmark. We baptize all the babies. They become citizens at the same time. And and then once that regime, that system is under threat, then it's not surprising that you get the explicit melding of Christian identity and your nationalist identity. And I think one of the things that Kierkegaard did in Denmark, right, and when you look at our own moment, is seeing that the dominant system, shared cultural structure of America is shifting dramatically. Who are those that feel threatened by the change? Who are those that resent, encounter with a greater amount of difference? And really acknowledging the reality of these others, that all the change and all the problems in our world are really that we're no longer connected to the church, that shows how our civic, economic, and governmental institution functions. So what do we need? We need our revival, blah, blah, blah. And then how do we relate to religion? How do we relate to the state? Well, we already know the truth. So we use whatever mechanisms necessary to act on God's behalf, be it make sure people don't vote, be it take over a denomination, be it keep Mark Driscoll in charge, even though he's toxic and horrible. There are all these justifications that come once the dominant social structure has been labeled God's. Then whatever pass you need happens. And I think, and that's Antichrist, because the other form of religion, the one he's modeling, is really that critical one, that prophetic one, the one that recognizes that structural systems of power never form disciples. And there's reasons. Because you're a disciple to the one that died cross dead, not the one that built crosses. And to me, that it's a lot. If in one sense the mainline decline was connected to a shifting of who were the religious stewards of power and the rise of white evangelicalism, But both of them in the early 20th century with mainline Protestants and today were too cozy with the role it played for the global imperial power.
That's exactly right. We need a Hammond B3, man, for that particular feisty little nugget of sermon wisdom. I know you're exactly right. And one of the things that continues to just stun me is the way that when you find your faith confused with or infected by this state power nationalist idea, what ends up occurring, I think, is it necessarily then makes the other now not, and again, I don't mean to be too conversionistic here. I'm speaking more in a kind of broadly language of the audience rather than what I might say. But rather than seeing the other as the lost, the sick, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the hungry, the poor, right? Instead of seeing that as the people we are meant to go witness to and then draw into the love of Christ, the other becomes the political enemy, right? It becomes the immigrant who, of course, is now not part of the political voting bloc. It becomes, anyone who you perceive as threatening to the status quo. So now movements that stand for justice, but it's a justice speaking truth to your power. Oh no, that's now what's called demonic. Right. So we have to narrate the other as not the one we are called to love. We now narrate the other as the one we must stand against in the name of God. And that's where, again, any use of force just becomes just war. And this is where, like in America, it's been not just heartbreaking, but utterly predictable, if Kierkegaard is right, which I think he is. Heartbreaking and predictable that Trumpism got such a foothold, right? It had to, because it was the necessary consequence. It flows out of the very thing that Kierkegaard was fighting, 200 years ago. And it's the thing that Augustine talks about. It's the thing that Jesus talked about. This is not some new manifestation of some weird shift we've now taken in Christian life. This is the oldest identity that threatens religious existence. And it's the idea that you let religion no longer be a critical intervention into power, where the power of powerlessness, as John Caputo talks so well about, the power of powerlessness now becomes, no. If powerlessness is powerful, think how much more powerful power would be, right? Like somehow that gets flipped. And you just throw your hands up and you look around and you're like, wait a minute. So now not only is loyalty to Christ confused with loyalty to a particular political leader or state, but this now starts becoming, and I just wrote an article about this, radically nested in conspiracism, because you've got to do work to convince yourself of all the things that your deepest held beliefs cut against. Right? Like it takes energy to be this confused about what you hold to be true. And that then becomes structural by the people, ironically, who reject anything like structural workings of power and justice. Right? Their structures are designed to occlude and make invisible structures. Yeah, which is super sexy and horrifying, right? And so this is where the demonic starts working, is it re-narrates identity. It doesn't just introduce a new belief into it. And now, my goodness, you start saying, well, maybe I can't trust my own eyes. I'll take Trump's word for how many people were at his rally. Well, maybe I can't trust the physicians because they're just part of this big thing that actually is eroding the we that know the truth. And suddenly then your community becomes so insular, so encapsulated, and so enclosed that it now has eroded and rejected a canonic example of relational love. It said, forget the widow, the orphan, the stranger, because they're just taking my tax money that I should keep, right? Forget the, immigrant at the border that we should reach out to and welcome and engage, because you know what? They're threatening my job. Everything becomes about my status, my power, my identity. And we forget what the young Yulin pastor says at the end of either or. It's an upbuilding thought to realize that in relation to God, we're always wrong, right? But when we try to, invest ourselves in this powerful strength of always being right, now there's this narrative within too many Christianity of never being wrong, never admitting defeat, never showing repentance. My goodness, we now have a church that thinks repentance is somehow weakness rather than the core of Christian strength. So, yeah, if Kierkegaard helps us see this, even if his context is slightly different, and even if some of the specifics we have to sort of, extrapolate and apply in our world, as far as I'm concerned, there's very little that could be more important for the church than learning that lesson.
Yeah.
And so if a strange, melancholic Dane who dies at 42 years old, having pissed off pretty much everybody except like his nephew is a big fan of his, like, this guy did not live a life of making people love him. And yet, my goodness, let's think about how the moral and political and religious exemplars of our world have lived. They tend to get sought out and destroyed by power. Well, maybe we should spend a little less time trying to make those in power comfortable, and spend a little bit more time trying to offer comfort to those who have been stripped of their identity and dignity as a result of power. I think Kierkegaard gives that idea to us.
Well, I think that you're perfectly setting up number 3.
Yeah.
You're just, look at that. You were anticipating the transition.
It's
Number
as if
3.
it were in front of me on my screen.
Oh, okay. Oh, well,
It's almost
don't ruin
as
the
if.
magic. Don't ruin the magic. The number 3, the third reason the church needs Kierkegaard today is Kierkegaard shows what it means to seek faithfulness rather than success.
Yeah. So this goes back to the way I'm framing this. I gave a TEDx talk a few years ago called The Failure of Success. And what I tried to do there was basically this fundamental Kierkegaardian theme. And it's not exclusively Kierkegaardian. I actually think, Jean-Paul Sartre's idea that it takes, faith to be an atheist, not in the sense of like, oh, well, I don't have good belief, so I've got to hold this, non-evidential claim. No, he means it takes faith to become whatever one is, right? And that idea of becoming a Christian, becoming an atheist, becoming a philosopher, becoming a husband, becoming a father, whatever the thing is that we think's worth our life. The goal is not to do it and check off the box, right? That would confuse, being a parent with giving birth to a child. You can give birth to a child and then fail to be a parent, because parenting requires investment and risk and struggle. I took my son camping this weekend. My favorite thing in the world to do is be with my son. And yet, he's 12, he's in middle school. Like, he's not exactly the guy who just listens to everything you say and is always cheery about it. Right. So, you're hiking up what?
It's true. I mean, Elgin's 13, definitely not the case.
We're hiking up a waterfall. The whole way is how many more steps? This is so dumb. My legs hurt. I'm so tired. Why do I have to wear a mask? I mean, all the things, right? Parenting is not, well, I did that 12 years ago when he was born. I'll see ya. Parenting is, I'm in the mess with you, man. And I'm also going to be on the mountaintops. So that whole we hiked like 850 stairs to the top of this waterfall. It was a long way. Calves were screaming today, but we get to the top. And then my son flips into this amazing little spark of joy and takes his phone out and is taking these pictures because he wants to share them with his friends, right? And then suddenly you're like, yeah, it's because we can walk together, that we get to enjoy the tops of mountains together, right? And that's faithfulness. Faithfulness is not rejecting success. I want to get to the top of the waterfall, check. No, we do. But if the goal is just to get to the top of the waterfall, then we say, well, nothing else matters. And once I've done it, I'm done. Mm-hmm. And what I want to say with Kierkegaard is no, the real hard part for Abraham, think about it this way, the hard part for Abraham, yes, certainly was being willing to, sacrifice his son, which loaded statement there that we would unpack in more detail the week we talk about fear and trembling. But the hard part for Abraham's got to be, how now does he come back off Mount Moriah and spend the next 40 years with his kid that he, tried to kill that day, right? Yeah. And Kierkegaard knows this. And so he starts Fear and Trembling with these really interesting moments where he's tuning up, he says. And he's tuning up like an orchestra. He's tuning up his audience and himself to be able to say, look, this story about Abraham, it's not check, he was faithful to God at that moment. That makes faith a success proposition. It's, can he then come back down and live in light of the decisions he's made and do this with others? So faithfulness, not success, invites us not to think about the goals in our life as box checking sorts of things. It instead invites us neither to be threatened by failure nor defined by success. Living faithfully says, hey, if my son and I didn't make it to the top of the waterfall, you know what? We had a heck of a hike today, and that's good, right? It's finding value and meaning and significance in these moments where we continue to struggle toward what matters. Martin Luther King models this when he says, I've been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you, right? The night before he gets assassinated. And that idea that, hey, it's not about me. It's about, are we still moving in the direction that we think is worth moving? And that's powerful. And Kierkegaard, his notion of faith as not being weak belief that we just don't have enough evidence to convert into knowledge, but it's faith as I'm in, right? I tell my students all the time, they say, how can you still believe in God? Aren't you too smart for that? And I was like, well, so you're saying would I prefer to live a life that is invested in the idea that other-oriented love is inscribed into the fabric of reality or not? Yeah, I'm in on that first one. That's what faith means to me. Is I'm in on that. I'm going to live everything I got into that. Yeah. And that's hope, but it's also risk. Faithfulness is hard because it's not final. It is something that is finite. It's something we do and have to keep doing.
Do you think part of it is the way in which faithfulness means showing up and you don't always know what the situation is, and success is a destination that you're set on wherever you're getting to? And I think that you gave the mountain image and the hike image and a number of them, but it's like the Mount of Transfiguration, right? Where Peter's like, well, let's build booths. Abraham and Elijah are here. This is high quality material. Why are we going to leave? And Jesus says he heads down to go to Jerusalem, which again triggers him. Why are you going to go there? You're going to get killed. And the question, they're thinking success in a very different kind of way. You've arrived. Now we know who you are, that your identity is established. And for Jesus, his identity was always the way he was walking and where the way he shows up in the world. It's similar to at marriage, when you do premarital counseling and people are smirking at each other with glee, and you're like, little did you now know the person that will hurt you more than anyone else in the world. And we all celebrate it if you've been married a while when you're at a wedding, and then you look at that person you're with and you're like, yeah, well, they don't know what they're signing up for yet. But when it's done well, you don't get to year 50 and go, success.
Yes. I'm done now, right? And in some senses, imagine if we took our broadly consumerist, particular notion of capitalist model of success and applied it to the things that we think matter most in the world, like marriage, right? We'd say, all right, well, what's the goal of being an entrepreneur? Well, it's to build a company and then exit it, right? Make tons of money and walk away. Took it public. I exited a billionaire. Woo, right? And now I'll start another one, right? Like, think about what that would look like in other areas of our life. I raised my kid to 13. Boom, done. Pass it off. Give me another. Like, well, hey, all right, spouse, we'll partner for, you got 10 years in you? All right, let's do 10 years. That will be successful. Then we'll have a freaking party. We'll celebrate with all our friends because we're going to exit. Awesome, right? Or professor, when our students graduate, the goal is not like, oh, thank God, done with that one, bring a new batch. The whole point is, have I invested in that person in such a way that now the rest of their lives, we're somehow still in conversation, even if I don't see them often, right? The idea of relational commitment, which I think is something COVID has taught all of us. We are not built for isolation, right? We are built for connectivity, but connectivity wrecks us because relationships are by definition something that you can't get to the apex, check the box, and walk away from. It's a matter of saying, do I keep showing up? Somebody told me once that a PhD program wasn't that hard. I mean, I disagree with this. It wasn't that hard. You just have to keep showing up. And that, I think, is right? How do you get a doctorate? You just keep going, right? When things get hard, I think I've told you one of our conversations we've had before, pulling off the side of the road on my way to Vanderbilt, stuck in traffic, sobbing. And I kept thinking and kept wrestling. I had read too much Kierkegaard, kept thinking, oh, but what if Abraham killed Isaac and Isaac was just dead? Like, would that still have been God? Or was it God only because things worked out, right? And that was on my mind because I was going crazy heavy in debt. Had just gotten married, risking my time with my wife because now I never saw her. I was heading to school every morning, working 80, 90 hours reading, trying to keep up with everything, risking our future. I knew the stats about marriages in grad school, right? I mean, you're a testament to beating the odds, my friend. So am I, right? So realizing this, sobbing on the side of the road because how do I just keep showing up? It would be so much easier to just stop. And that's why the title of the course we're doing together is Getting Lost and Finding Faith, Walking with Kierkegaard. It's because walking is a matter of saying, hey, there will be times where your calf muscles will start burning. And there's going to be other times where my knee's giving me trouble. And so walking is, we're not entirely sure where we're going to end up. We got some ideas. We have some plans. That waterfall looks pretty cool. Let's go see that one. But you know what? The walking, again, the faithing, that's the thing that matters. And this is also part of why I think, like, some people say, you don't get married for the wedding. The wedding is something to inaugurate a marriage. Yeah. Part of me thinks, like, weddings should be crazy expensive because then you probably got a real good reason to stay together at least 25 years to pay that stuff off, right? like maybe that's a good reason to make them big deals. I don't know, but you're right, man. It's Kierkegaard just refuses to allow life to be cheap. And ironically, or very sensibly, I guess, it's his idea of the costliness of Christian faith that then gives rise to what we find in Bonhoeffer about the cheap and costly grace distinction. It's nested in Kierkegaard's practice in Christianity. He's already drawn this distinction. And he says at one point, we live now in a society where everything can be had at a low price. It's a, blue light special, he says, in the marketplace of ideas, because everything, you can have everything, right? Think about TED Talks, 10 minutes, you can know everything there is about a nuanced subject that nobody understands. Do your own research because, PhDs in actual integrity and research, we don't need to do that, right? Walmart models of human life and thinking, Kierkegaard already understood, and he was terrified about this. And he says, no. Costly faith is the only kind of faith there is. Everything else is what he says, the key to despair. You will despair because you don't have what you wish you had, or you're going to despair because you got what you wanted, and it turns out it doesn't satisfy. faith is the only way forward, where despair becomes something now that we're trying to root out rather than something we're trying to kind of just live with. And man, if that doesn't speak to a overworked, overstressed, overtaxed world, I don't know what does.
Well, I know there's a fourth reason the church needs.
I've heard a rumor
today.
about it. Yeah.
Kierkegaard stresses the radical inclusivity of the call, come all who are heavy burdened.
This is an important one because Kierkegaard, anyone who reads Kierkegaard, the most charitable reader of Kierkegaard, still is going to wrestle with his conception of community. And he doesn't have, we might say, a very thick notion of ecclesiology for all the reasons we've been talking about, right? He's worried about these established structures. But as we also know, the ecclesia wasn't about an established structure, the let's build a church on top of the Mount of Transfiguration. Let's decide who's going to be on the right hand of Jesus and let that person be pastor, right? Like that's never what the ecclesia was about. Instead, it's about what does it mean to realize that there's always been a we when we talk about one's relation to God. There's always been disciples, right? That's why whenever they kept saying, well, who's your favorite disciple? Who's the most important? Who's your, like Jesus just always rebukes this stuff, right? Because each one of them had individual relationships with Christ, of course. And this is, I think I've said many times, one of my favorite postmodern epistemology points in the Bible is the fact that the New Testament starts with 4 personal accounts of who Jesus is. And you'd think if objective, apologetic industry capitalism were the case, just pick the best one. We've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, which one's going to be the best for the audience? Which one's going to work the quickest to make sure that they can get out for the, Ryan's buffet after service? And instead, we get all 4. Why? And I think the answer is because what it means to be in relation to God is to be personally invested in who God is as revealed in Christ. And that then requires a personal relation walk. So we get 4 examples of what that walk looks like. And they're all good, right? They've all got different emphases reflecting the different people and the different modes in which they walk with Christ. So the idea of recognizing the we doesn't lead to some sort of evacuation of subjectivity. It's precisely the opposite. You're only you, Tripp, because your parents and your wife and your kids and your audience see you as the you that you are, but you're a different you to your audience than you are to your kid. And you're indifferent to your kid than you are to your wife, right? I mean, when we confuse those roles, things get weird, right? I can't be to my students what I am to my wife. I'd get sued and fired. But I also can't be to my wife what I am to my students, because she'd divorce me. If all I did was lecture to her all the time about the importance of Kierkegaard, that's not a relationship. But I'm both of these things because the we, as Sartre understands, constitutes the I. Levinas got this by saying it's the other that looks at me that creates the I as responsible. So what Kierkegaard does by really focusing in his late work on this invitation, come to me, all who are heavy burdened, I will give you rest. What he does is says it's an invitation to all. Therefore, Christian nationalism is ruptured from the outset, right? Mm-hmm. Therefore, the other that we're trying to guard against is immediately the other that we're trying to invite and welcome. Mm-hmm. So what we get is a model of wrecking Christian nationalism in the name of a faith risky life that then gets manifest in gratitude and hospitality. And that hospitality is something that Kierkegaard himself didn't flesh out. So again, his ecclesia, his community, his notion of politics is, I would say, something that, commentators rightly do a lot of work trying to think through. And there's a lot of disagreement. I just wrote a paper recently called Kierkegaard at the Intersections. It was all about Kierkegaard and intersectional identity theory, Patricia Hill Collins and others. And, the reviewers, I had some were like, this is amazing. This is great. It's pushing him in new directions. This is so wonderful. I had others saying, this isn't Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard had cared nothing at all about identity and political life and existence, right? And they're both right because Kierkegaard gives us a frame, and then it also invites us to figure out what we're going to do by living into that. And so, come all who are heavy burdened, my big point there would just be to say, look, if you are in a Christian community and your goal is not simply to save the lost, but to be poured out to the marginalized and the suffering and the weak, if that's not your goal, if that's not what you're doing as a faithfulness task, then it's not the Christianity we find in Kierkegaard. It's not the Christianity we find in Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's not the Christianity we find in Martin Luther King, right? It's a Christianity that I think actually has been more like the Christianity we find in the established Danish church that wanted to reinforce the kind of hegemony of the elite rule there in Copenhagen by pressuring that out into the rural spaces that were being so effective and influenced by Moravian pietism, that were starting to undermine some of that established idea, some of that elitist conception of we are the we that matter and they are the problem. Kierkegaard, though he doesn't flesh it out, his reading of scripture is unambiguous. You do not get to be a Christian if hospitality does not define your life.
Yeah. In hospitality, you don't know what it is you're opening yourself up to.
Yes.
Right. I think that that kind of hospitality, if it's only given out of your privilege on behalf of it, isn't the kind of hospitality you see, be it Abraham, and the three guests all the way through, the kind of hospitality Jesus invites his followers to practice.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
All right. The fifth and final reason the church needs Kierkegaard today. Kierkegaard models what it looks like to see humility as the condition of confidence.
Yeah.
So while you're not 100% sure that this is absolutely right, nonetheless,
you keep stepping, right? What's that old Big Daddy Kane track? Ain't no half stepping. Like, that's precisely Kierkegaard's philosophy. There ain't no half stepping when it comes to life. There's no half stepping when it comes to faith. You're moving, you're standing. But the whole point is, but where you are moving, right, toward what you're moving and where you stand, you could stand other places and you could move in other directions. There are other hikes we could be taking right now. There are other waterfalls that might have been a better waterfall. You can't ever get rid of that fact. And so with hospitality, and you anticipate this so well by making this kind of subtle Derridian move, right? When we open our door, we at some level can't ever know what will be on the other side of the door. The other is at some level unknown to us. And the hospitality says, I'm going to take that risk, come in. And so humility is the recognition I could have my place and keep my doors locked because it's comfortable. Hospitality means I've got to be humble enough to recognize when I open my doors to another, they might challenge what I do and why I do it and how I do it. So my life now becomes an expression of kenosis. But my goodness, Jesus, right? The maximal example of radical humility in all of, we might say, at least one of the great examples in all of human history. Wow. Was he somehow wishy-washy about where he stood? Was he not quite, did he go into the, church with the money changers and say, y'all, you can see why some people would have problems with what you're doing. What do y'all think? Right now, he goes in, kicks over tables. He's like, this is not okay, right? When he's giving the Sermon on the Mount, he doesn't say, the meek probably will inherit the earth if X, Y, and Z, right? The whole point, he's standing, but he's standing in the context that recognizes, guess how the meek will inherit the earth if meekness becomes a virtue. So be meek, right? Now, how is it that love of the neighbor and love of the God constitute Christian life? Because that's what Christians do, and they live into it with full confidence. But confidence is not certainty, right? Because this goes back to number one. Why is it so important that faith is about commitment, not just about right belief? Because if it's about right belief, then those people who have the right belief, they can be certain, which means they don't have to model humility, which means now they're out of line with God's own example in Christ as kenotic. Mm-hmm. And two, why would they be hospitable? That only means that they're going to potentially change their belief, but they were certain. So why would they change it? Right? So the whole idea is it's only if faith is lived commitment that we can be humble, we can be hospitable, and then we can live with others and God in a mode that lets for real walks to happen. And I'm in when it comes like that. That's an account of Christianity that I'm okay with, and I hope is true. And that's why Kierkegaard makes it possible for me to still be a Christian.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess since we decided to do this together, we'll probably both find this compelling. But one of the things that ties those 3 points together, you were connected, is that when one's identity as a Christian is connected to certainty, finality, right belief, then the kind of truth the Christian seeks after is a lot closer to a logical syllogism or a mathematical equation than, a love poem.
That's right.
Or marriage vows, right? And I think that it's not for Kierkegaard that the ideas are pointless. It's just they're there to provoke, like the embodiment of that love, or the embodiment of that truth, or the embodiment of that beauty. And when you think of faith as much more akin to poetry, or then it has to do with being seized and being moved and trusting and giving yourself. And you own that. If you do that without humility, then you don't understand the risk that's entailed. And I think that's true for lots of people if that's how they were going to manage their relationships. But I just remember, for me, Kierkegaard problematizes the task of the theologian in really helpful ways. I remember in undergrad, I guess I won't use their name since this is on the internet, but a certain individual who had kind of memorized all the correct answers on behalf of Geneva. He was a Calvinist and knew the book of James by memory, and would regularly let us know how much scripture he had memorized. And I found him to be about as off-putting as it gets. Like, so much I didn't even want to agree with him. Right. And I think that I mean, that's a hyperbolic example, but I think a lot of people feel insecure in their faith because they think they need to have the right beliefs sorted out or have the truth pinned down and locked down. And in our age, that's never going to happen. You're never going to have all the answers, be it an atheist or a theist of any sort. And that the inability to lock things down is the conditions for genuine faith.
Yeah, that's right.
And I that was just wonderful to me, because then the actual thinking through the ideas is a creative and constructive activity in response to the one you've encountered in Christ. But like, it's not, you're not in charge of all that. You're just trying to do the best job to give an account of what has seized you and why you exist in this tradition and seek to pass it on. But the living of it is whatever, when you gave the examples of the Gospels, the Gospels are all pointing to an encounter with the living God, that that encounter came through a homeless first century Jew. And they all say that's true. And then they tell their own stories. Right. And the collapsing of the distinctions and difference is to misunderstand the gift of
That's
a
right.
multiplicity of testimonies.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Again, and I keep waiting for the walking bass line to start, Tripp. No. I say, if you want to go into the Pentecostal worship service, baby, I'm ready. But you're exactly right. As we say in my churches, that'll preach, right? But why will it preach? Precisely because this is then an account that says, look, when you try to lock it all down, when you try to make sure that, yes, you're showing off how much scripture that how much your view align with the right thinker in the right ways, etc. Again, it's about the syllogistic algorithm. It's about the proposition, and it's about your own certainty. Notice that person you're describing, the temptation is that he now gets to think he's better at life of faith because he knows more internal to it. But what we see is precisely Jesus continue to say, right? He's not saying don't study, don't be rigorous. He's not saying don't be nuanced and reflective, but he says, unless you're like a kid, you're missing it. And the reason is because kids are transformed in that encounter. My son, yesterday, we were found this big stick and he wanted to whittle it into a walking stick. And I'm like, that sounds like a great idea. Let me show you how to do it safely. Okay. So he's whittling. And I said, why'd you pick this stick? And he was like, oh, look at this big, it's got this like curly burl thing up here. Isn't this awesome? And it goes down inside. And then he realizes that there's slugs down inside this little, pocket where the wood had split. He's like, Dad, look, there's all these slugs. Immediately, that stick could not be used to make a walking stick because it was going to disrupt the slugs' home, right? And I said, cool, man, let's go find another one. But he could not go find another one until that stick got put back where he had found it in the woods, because these slugs were encountered by him, right? Think about it. His future plans to make this stick into a success outcome, a walking stick, they got ruptured by the encounter with a slug, man. And yet we somehow don't think the encounter of 700,000 people dying from a disease that we know how to prevent the spread of, we don't even care about that encounter somehow as a church. Like how far we have gotten from what it looks like to say, it's not about my certainty, it's about my love. Kierkegaard has this great line under the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio, where he says, we get no resemblance to Abraham through murder, but only through love. Wow. That's why that text, right? Which again, we're going to talk about in later weeks. That text isn't about, well, how could we justify terrorism in the name of God? I wrestled with that because you talked about 9/11. When I first was reading Kierkegaard was during 9/11. And so I read Fear and Trembling right before 9/11 happened. I was like, oh my gosh, like, how is Kierkegaard not justifying what we just watched? Isn't this God told people and they did this thing? Isn't that what Abraham did? And I remember finding that passage. It's not through murder that we have this relation. It's through love. Yeah, because it's the being ruptured by the encounter rather than being exalted by our knowledge, right? You and I live the life of the mind, man. We're happy to talk about knowing and wrestle with ideas and dig deep. I'm all in on that. The problem is when we start thinking that makes us better than other people.
Yeah.
Right? Now you've got legitimate working class frustration with the quote unquote elite, right? There's a reason there that is worth taking seriously. And yet, when we think it's all about certainty, it's all about having, it's all about being, rather than it's about becoming in humble confidence, hopeful that something like the narrative of Christianity is true. And I should say, just as a qualifier, because some of your audience will not know my work, none of this means therefore exclusivism relative to Christian soteriology, right?
Oh yeah.
All of my saying, I hope Christianity or something like it is true, is an attempt to say, you know what? I find very similar aspects to the ones that we're drawing out in other religious traditions and even non-religious traditions. But there's something about, I find myself in Christianity that makes it the poem that speaks to me in a particular way, right? Because I grew up in that encounter. So this is not about Christianity beating something else.
Well, and I think, just the fact that Kierkegaard has this legacy within Christian theology, but also the whole existentialist movement in some sense is reading Kierkegaard going, Kierkegaard's trying to figure out the task of being human. Yeah. And his cultural context is Christendom. So that's the myths and stories and rituals and things that he's working it out with. But like when Kierkegaard says, I hope to become a Christian, you can take it out of Christendom and say, I hope to have lived before I died. And so they're both there, and in the class you'll see how it's simultaneously like a rich philosophical theology and also a philosophy that you don't have to be a Christian to benefit and engage, because it kind of it functions both ways.
So when I teach this stuff, I'm always clear to my students, look, we can read Kierkegaard without the Christian specificity, and you will get a robust, compelling existential invitation. But if we read it that way, we're also missing something robust about who Kierkegaard was as a thinker. And the danger is that we strip away the specificity of his existence and think there's some sort of non-specific finitude that we somehow could strive for. Yeah. And so when I teach him, I'm like, no, we're going to take his Christianity seriously, because that allows you to take your atheism or your agnosticism or your skepticism or your Buddhism or Hinduism or Baha'ism, whatever it is. Now be good at that, whatever that is, right? And this is where I also think one of the problems that we have as a kind of legacy of pluralism, especially coming out of John Hick and others, is we tend to think the way that we don't step on toes of others is by kind of finding those cores and then letting the specifics sort of just become peripheral. Yeah. And what I think Kierkegaard does as an existentialist, he says, nah, the specifics, what we would now call the embodied condition, is one that requires the specifics and the context to be part of our narrative. And so why am I threatened by the fact that the thing that then is so alive in me is something that would look different alive in you? Nah, that's what allows us now to have a conversation worth having, right? It's precisely that difference that is nested in the shared human condition that makes the condition a condition worthwhile. And I think that, I hope lots of people will come join us for the class, because you don't have to agree with Kierkegaard on any of the specific Christian theological points to be challenged by him to be a better you, whatever that means, right? It's like I tell people that philosophy is about learning to love well. It doesn't actually tell you what you should love, other than abstract truth, goodness, beauty, these, but then it doesn't really flesh those out. That's why you read a bunch of people in Intro to Philosophy, not just one, right? And so whatever that you end up loving, it's like that Donovan Woods kind of Americana folk track where he says, but I want to be a good lover, right? Kierkegaard and philosophy help us be good lovers, right? And there's your tagline, right? Come to this class, be a better lover. But ultimately that, I think, is what Kierkegaard invites us into. Well, despite the fact that he was a horrible, horrible lover, best we can tell. And he gets
they'll get to read the Diary of the Seducer. And,
yes, he got it. That's right.
So go to iHeartKierkegaard.com and you can sign up and come have some fun with us.
That's right. Bring your B3 organ when you come, and give us a backing track. It'd be great.
Yeah. All righty. Peace out, peoples. All right. Let me turn off the recording.